Nana Atumfo, Nana Num, distinguished guests, and the public, I am very honored indeed to make this short presentation about the SAGRENTI War. I want to start very quickly with a review of the reign of Kwaku Agyeman, who died in 1867. The reason I am doing this is simple. Kwaku Agyeman was the most pernickety and stickler sort of man when it came to the law. He is known as Kwaku Anansi, Kwaku the Wise. He is known as Agyeman Bambuo. He was somebody who really enforced the laws of Asante. In the process, he gathered together a great deal of money in gold dust, principally, but also in specie and other things. And I say all this because I want to underline and emphasize something that I think has been overlooked. When Nana Kwaku Agyeman died in 1867, he left behind a very great deal of money. And I will give you some idea of this. The money was stored in three places. It was stored in the McCASKIE, the great chest in the treasury. It was stored in the Asante's country palace at Abaraso, and it was stored elsewhere at Breman. The sums involved I've been able to calculate because we know the dimensions of the McCASKIE, and with assistance from members of the British Mint, chemists, engineers, the kind of people who can know about the science of gold and the measurement of gold and all the rest of it, we have calculated that the amount of gold contained in the McCASKIE alone at Kwaku's death was in excess of 400,000 ounces. Now, the 100,000 ounces in 1867 were worth £1.2 million sterling. But you know what's happened to gold in our lifetime? The current value of the McCASKIE is somewhere over £2 billion. A lot of money. Now, he left this money to his successor, Kofi Kakari. And Kofi Kakari was a wastrel. He distributed money to buy popularity, and he was eventually destooled at the end of the SAGRENTI War. I'll come to the war in a moment, but let me simply say that, to underline what I've already said, that the attempt to get back the treasures looted from Kumasi by Sir Garnet Wolseley in 1874 takes no account, because it cannot, of the gold in gold dust and unworked gold that the British must have carried away with them. We don't know about this. Of course we don't know, because it was loot, private loot, and so it is separate from the cultural artifacts that Nana Atumfo is trying to retrieve for the Asante man and retrieve for the Republic of Ghana. Now, the war itself is often referred to generally as a colonial war, one of Britain's first colonial wars. But we can refine that a little. We can refine it, in fact, quite a lot. In the 1860s and 1870s, Britain came to realize that it did not have a first-class army. In fact, it was an army composed of people rather like in the 18th century who had bought their commissions. And this had to change, and change it did, and the leader of this change was Sir Garnet Wolseley. Assisted by the War Secretary, Edward Cardwell, he modernized the army. And of course, this didn't mean just modernizing how it was run. It was modernized from the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. And I will name only a couple of things here. The British came to Asante in 1874 to make war, 1873 to make war, with telegraph communications, with people on board the ships who brought the officers to advise them on what Asante was like. In other words, intelligence gathering on a new and unusual scale. They also had with them, and perhaps most crucially, Snider rifles. These were the result of revolutionary developments in armaments. And unlike the flintlocks used by the Asante or the muskets used by the Asante, these were very accurate, long-range repeating rifles. The first, or at least one of the first, among modern rifles. So they came, and they came with all this in their baggage and their intentions. Now, Wolseley himself was determined to rise to be head of the British Army, which he eventually did. And he brought with him to Asante a group of officers known as the Wolseley Ring, the Ring of Friends, who would rise with him. So there was a very personal motive in Wolseley fighting this war and being seen to have fought it and won it for himself, for Britain, for Queen Victoria and the rest. And we have proof of this. This was the first war in which the general in command, Wolseley, was accompanied by large numbers of the British press. This war was reported very extensively in England, with jubilation, of course, when Kumasi was taken. Now, the Asante themselves, Kwekadu Agyeman, for the 30 years of his reign, had maintained a hands-off policy towards any of the states south of the Pra and the Europeans. There were no real or significant Asante military ventures south of the Pra in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Kwekadu Agyeman's view of things was that Asante ruled inland itself and its northern dependencies, and the British ruled the whites on the coast. So it was a world vision that really contrasted the two worlds of Africa and Europe. He was the ruler of Africa, and they were the rulers of the South, led by the whites. But of course, this was nothing to do with what Wolseley wanted or what the British government backed him to want. And so, despite the fact that in 1873, the Asantehene withdrew those military forces he had on the borders of the Pra and southwards into almost Fanti, he withdrew them and tried to make peace with the British. Wolseley absolutely refused. There is no other word for it. He turned him down flat because Wolseley and the British government were determined to have their war. Now you can imagine the kind of propaganda that was put about by the British about Asante. A savage despotism, blood running in the streets, endless sacrifices, barbarians, racism in short, and very highly developed Victorian racism. So Wolseley crossed the Pra and went to Kumasi. Now, one of the things that's almost never noticed about the occupation is that he was only there for a couple of days. He was frightened that the Asante would counterattack. He was frightened that the army he led would come down with tropical diseases. And so, having secured his victory, he scurried back to the coast very, very quickly, stopping only at Flomina, where he sent to enforce a treaty he had drawn up with the Asantehene Kofi Kakari. The treaty was a treaty of, and you may are allowed to laugh at this point, the treaty was a treaty of permanent peace between Britain and Asante. And he asked that Kofi Kakari, as a sign of goodwill, hand over 50,000 ounces of gold to show his good faith. He never did that, but that's another story. Now, in the occupation of Kumasi, the place was, as previous speakers have said to you, the city was burned and comprehensively looted. The Aban, the big story building constructed by Asante Bonsozi Tutu Kwame in 1819 to 22, the King's Own Palace, they were all ransacked by the British. Now, I've told you the amount of gold that was floating about Asante at this time in dust. We have no account of this. Soldiers just filled their pockets or took it away in little wrappings and things like that. So we just do not know about that, but we do know about the cultural treasures. And I just want to mention two of them in passing, and they're simply this. In the Wellcome collection, the foundation in London, there is the largest gold mask known from sub-Saharan Africa. It is a portrait of the Bandahini Woroza, defeated and killed by the Asante Hinyosa Kwanwo in the 1760s, and it weighs over 2 kilos. Its current value in gold alone, never mind its aesthetic value, its cultural value, its value in gold alone is over 80,000 pounds sterling. The other piece of loot that I want to particularly emphasize was not taken in 1874. It was taken in 1896 when the British returned and arrested Asante Hiniajaman Prempeh. Now, you would think this was nothing. Somebody must have just picked it up and taken it away. It was a brass basin called the McCASKIE, which was displayed before the Royal Mausoleum at Bantama and was part of the practices of recalling the ancestral monarchs of Asante. It is simply a brass basin, but the British took it away. When Prempeh came back in 1929, he wrote to the British and tried to get this battered brass basin restored. And the British wouldn't give him it. And it is still in Britain at the United Services, the Army Museum in London. The war itself had a catastrophic effect on Asante. Catastrophic in the sense that, well, in a number of senses. Above all, it shattered unity. Asante works best when it's united under its king. The British seduced away and led away large numbers of defectors into the Gold Coast colony, and Asante descended into a period of anarchy. Now, you all know that this anarchy was capped. Its lowest point was the civil war that occurred in Asante between 1883 and 1888. There is no doubt at all that the British encouraged resistance to Kumasi, whether by giving arms, which was illegal, of course, and which they never talked about publicly, money, or just general support, and above all, refuge to those who opposed the Asante Hini in the Gold Coast colony, which they had established in 1874 after the SAGRENTI War. I haven't got much time left, so I will simply cover what is left of the story. In 1892, the British wrote to Asante Hiniajaman Prempeh I, offering him British protection. That is, that Asante, which he was trying to restore to its former status after the Civil War, that Asante should come under formal British protection. Ajaman Prempeh simply refused. He said, no, we're an independent kingdom. Not only did he refuse, he sent an embassy to London to underline his point that Asante was an independent kingdom. The embassy spent some time in London, but the British government refused to see it. And while it refused to see it, it was planning a second invasion of Asante. And this occurred as the embassy returned to the coast and the British advanced on Kumasi again in 1896. There, Agyeman Prempeh was faced by one of the greatest challenges that any Asantehene has faced. Should he fight? Should he not? The solution he came up with is beyond admirable. He knew that after the SAGRENTI War and after the civil wars, he knew perfectly well that if the British unleashed their military power now on what was a weakened Asante, people would suffer in enormous numbers. So instead of permitting this to happen, he decided to surrender himself and his mother and various other of his dignitaries in his family to the British, provided they prosecuted no military action in Asante. So he was taken away as a British captive, and the rest of the story you know. He remained on the coast until 1900, and then he was sent to Sierra Leone, and finally to the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, from which he did not return until 1924. But the Asante themselves had had enough of this. In 1896, when they took Prempeh away, they established a system of direct military informal rule through collaborationist chiefs, people that they had appointed themselves to run the country for them. This only lasted for 4 years because the Asante themselves, ordinary people led by chiefs as well, fostered, created, and fought a military uprising against the British in 1900. This is commonly known as the Yasantiwako because of the heroic behavior of the Jwesihiba, the woman Yasantiwa. That war ended in the ruthless suppression of the Asante. This time, there was no offer of perpetual peace. There was no offer of friendship. There was simply the fact that Asante was made a British Crown colony in 1901, was given a British governor to rule over it in the absence of an Asantehene, and in the aftermath of the war, large numbers of people convicted of treason against the British Crown by fighting for Asante in that war were jailed, hanged, or otherwise deported. Now, there's very little else I need to say, except that this is a shameful episode in British history, like most of British colonialism. It is a shameful episode because it was based on industrial might and a racial ideology. The British were never a great continental military power. They did not have large land armies. What they did have and what they pursued was an overseas empire from which they could extract money through trade, preferential rates, and all the rest of it. And Asante was one of the earliest additions across the world to that particular empire. It's often forgotten, and this is my final remark here, it's often forgotten how short British colonialism was. When I came to Asante, age 22, with Adubuahen in 1968, I met people who had lived all the way through the British period. They were born before the British came, and they were there when the British left in 1957. So it is time finally to put this episode in the past and to reassert Asante unity under the Asantehene and go forward into the future. And I encourage most strongly Asante man to pursue further the matter of the restoration of the treasures that were taken in 1874 and taken in 1896. Thank you very much.
denti ne ebube ne brebe nse si ebube ebe ye de den
kura preko enim sebe odwampopo bi esi kuro ni mu awase wadore sra
Tanyini wantena fie ema aseduamfo
blani pie frimantam bahin se pin enye nkwande wa na yesotro no wa
ansa na odi asebe fita na no makode ebrensi am wa wotua ne nsem mojabmo ni mu hu bi
duanani wie klaman wo ye sofo kra wo nye bi
tontonte ye no sane ye fa
Nyansapo
Abone ntaka na mane yakese na ntakra abone de fanyinam kwatere kwa
mada woro ma ntuma ye fe ni din de sey
ni din de Obama
akola wa no so pese utrimu usuma ense bratam
the confirm ne honhon hia na America sa
sebe ka ya twere ni mu nyame nai ebu afaso enye de ya twere ni mu twa nyame
sebedi akone be kwen bodi atwede na se kofi nro ni ya aben ntima nyina ni mu ampata na wo yade ya